that we should kick off here in, well, most of us are in Singapore. So greetings to the people in Melbourne who have joined this this particular session of Intersect, and it's entitled Cracking into the Singapore Market. So we've got a great set of panelists today that span the ecosystem and who will share their views and experience in terms of the Singapore FinTech market. By brief introduction, my name is Stephen Skulley. I'm the Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner here in Singapore for Austrade. As you'll see, we're all in various states of dress because we've just gone into lockdown, which the people in Melbourne know all about. It's our second version. This is our second day of the second version, so we're still getting used to it. Let's hope technology is our friend today. Just briefly on Austrade, Austrade has a FinTech trade and investment program that is federally funded, which was done last year. And Singapore is one of the key focus cities or countries around that. The others are USA and the UK. So in Singapore, Austrade has a long-established presence here. We have great and deep connections across government and business and across this broader ecosystem. We help Australian exporters and investors with their issues, and particularly focus for this particular session will be scale-ups coming into the Singapore market. We also have a landing pad here, which over the last 3 years has supported approximately 50 scale-up companies assess the Singapore market. Some have come in and been successful, and one of them is on the panel now. And there's others that have taken stock of the messages that have been given by the market. So without further ado, I'll just briefly introduce the panel, and then we'll move into questions, given that we only have a limited amount of time. So first of all, we have Omaru. He's the CEO of Oculus, and he has successfully started up in Singapore, so he'll have a great story to tell. And then we have Lisa from R3I Ventures, who's a founding partner, and she's assisted many companies, FinTech companies coming to the market, and is a great mentor to them as well. Then we have Lucas from K&L Gates, who's a legal counsel, and again has worked in this FinTech sector. We also have Rebecca Martin from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who I'll just call MAS from now on, and she's a senior executive officer. And then we have Victor from City Ventures, who's a director there and is the head of programs and strategic partnerships. So you can see we really do span the FinTech ecosystem here. So we're going to launch into a series of questions. The first sort of grouping will be around the Singapore FinTech ecosystem itself, and what better place to start than with Rebecca. The MAS here is known for developing and supporting the local and global FinTech community. So Rebecca, can you share with us a brief overview of the Singapore FinTech ecosystem? And I should have said, apologies, and just give us a brief introduction to yourself.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Intersect. Good to be with you virtually. Very jealous of those of you gathering together in Melbourne at the moment. Rebecca from the FinTech group at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. I guess to answer your question about the Singapore FinTech ecosystem, the way MAS sees our kind of opportunity or our potential is really in B2B FinTech. So we're a very small consumer market. Yet we house a lot of the largest financial institutions in the world, or we have a hub for them. And I think there's now over 40 FinTech innovation labs that financial institutions have set up here. So a big part of our kind of mandate with the FinTech group is to see how we better support collaboration between financial institutions and FinTechs in that B2B space. And in terms of the ecosystem, so there's a report that was published this week by BCG, which shows that 2020 was a record year for Singapore in terms of FinTech investment, which is pretty incredible given the pandemic. So there's 1.4 billion invested into Singaporean FinTech organizations in 2020. And they also showed that so far this year, there's been another $500 million invested. And of those investments, 5 were of Series C companies. So again, it's showing that slight maturity that we're getting here in Singapore. And as the ecosystem matures, I think it's even more important for MAS to have a touch point with founders, with the industry, and make sure that we're adjusting regulation and adjusting support dependent on what the startups, what you guys actually need. So There's three initiatives. I'll be brief, Stephen, I promise. Three initiatives I wanted to highlight quickly that might be interesting for you guys, and happy to share more afterwards if you want to reach out. The first is Deal Fridays, which is an initiative we launched 3 years ago to bring together fintech founders with investors. So on a monthly basis, we curate 5 to 10 fintechs that are raising funds and introduce them to our global network of investors in pitch events. We've done that mainly for Singapore-based fintechs historically, but this year we have more of an ASEAN mandate. And we have also done a couple of sessions with Chinese fintechs, with Indian fintechs. So Stephen and I perhaps are going to look at doing an Australian fintech focused one so that we can support you guys on your story coming across to Singapore. The second initiative is Green Shoots, which is a weekly fintech meetup that we started when Singapore went into lockdown, so last March. And it covers topics ranging from the advice that VCs are giving to startups through to announcements around public sector support that's being offered. And we regularly get about 5,000 plus attendees that join these, and over 100 questions asked during these sessions. So the aim is to be as interactive as possible, and any questions that aren't answered, we get the answers from the right people afterwards. So that's a kind of important session that you could join. And then finally, the big one for us is the Singapore FinTech Festival, which I'm sure many of you have come across before. That's our flagship event here in Singapore that happens once a year. And it's grown over the last 5 years from 5,000 people up to last year where we had 60,000 people joining around the world, and satellite events taking place in 45 fintech hubs, all collectively in the same week. So do join us this November. We see it as a kind of key touch point with the industry, a way to celebrate what's been achieved and a way to form new partnerships and new investments. So yeah, 8th of November, wouldn't be doing this without a little plug in there. So that's my plug for SFS.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca. So I think that set the scene really well, and truly the MAS has really helped create a great ecosystem here in Singapore for fintechs. So so Lisa, we might turn to you to introduce yourself briefly, but also then give from your perspective as an investor and mentor in the fintech space, what are the key elements that you see in Singapore's ecosystem, and how does that impact the startup community here?
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Intersect. My name is Lisa Salud. I'm the General Partner of R3I Ventures. We play a very active role as entrepreneurs in residence to governments and also to the acceleration ecosystem, as well as a venture capitalist. We basically cherry pick from the ecosystem in order to ideally make the best investments. We're a cross-border venture capitalist, so we have the opportunity to view the fintech ecosystem, not just, of course, across the ASEAN region, heavily into Luxembourg, in the second largest ecosystem in Europe. So we've got a great point of comparison in terms of what really differentiates Singapore as a first point of entry for this region. I think there are three things that really matter to us as founders, right? The first is capitalization. Rebecca gave the Singapore numbers of investment, but actually when you look at the Asia Pacific investment, it was more like $15 billion. This is a huge amount of investment that is going into the fintechs across the region and is really providing them with the capital in order to make those significant foundations that are required to pass through the regulatory hurdles and get to market. The second one is commercialization. And Rebecca referenced the 40 innovation hubs that have been set up by the financial institutions in the market. There's actually 197 accelerators in this ecosystem now, not only for fintech, but across the region. And we also have a significant amount of non-dilutive capital that drives those proof of concept and proof of value pathways for you to demonstrate that your technology is going to do what it says on the tin and deliver value to the customer. And I think it's those three critical ingredients that really set this innovation ecosystem apart from any other on the planet. What do we think helps founders? I think I can only speak from the 50 odd founders that we've landed in this region over the last 2 years. One of the biggest challenges with coming from the Australian market is that the first thing you have to do in order to get domestic capital on the large part is actually to set up a Singapore operation. And to do that, you need access to talent. And Singapore has been, particularly in the pandemic, really restricting that access to flow of people in and out for obvious reasons. The beauty of Singapore is we are a digital economy. And as you know, we are a digital economy in collaboration with the Australian government. And this provides us with a significant amount of capability and resource that we don't have among other regions in this area. And so you have the opportunity, even if you are stuck in Australia, to still land on the ground here virtually and to connect into that commercialization, capitalization, and non-dilutive pathway. You can get a company set up pretty much in 72 hours, which I think is also unparalleled across the planet. And you can also start to accelerate your access to an entrepreneur. And that's the key working permit that you need to get set up in the region. I was with ESG yesterday. With the right accelerator behind you, you can pretty much get your work passes within the week. So this is a really compelling value proposition to getting up and started.
Great, thank you, Lisa. That was really very insightful. Okay, so now we're going to turn to someone who has cracked the market, and Omaru, to introduce himself and his company. And I will say he's actually sitting very close to the audience in a breakout room tucked away. So if you see him walking around the rest of the event, you know, you should grab him and get some more insights. But for now, we'll take his introduction to himself, and then perhaps respond to, as a CEO of an Australian company that has successfully entered the Singapore market, what is your overall impression of the Singapore FinTech ecosystem?
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Intersect. Apologies if I'm a little bit choppy. I understand the Wi-Fi is a little bit overloaded, but you know, I hope you can hear me. It's great to be here. My name is Omaru, and I'm the CEO of Nicolet-Serra. Nicolet-Serra, you know, in one sentence, is an API security company, and we secure API exchanges between a service provider and a user. In terms of my impressions of Singapore as fintech ecosystem, I think what drives the ecosystem in Singapore is, you know, primarily Singapore is considered a financial hub. A lot of global and big financial services companies have their regional headquarters in Singapore. The government of Singapore has a number of programs and initiatives, you know, particularly MAS. They play a very active role in making sure that that ecosystem is constantly stimulated, it's active. So I loved that about Singapore, and I think that's one of the things that really make, you know, the fintech ecosystem, the startup ecosystem, and I guess in general the business ecosystem in Singapore quite active. We also happen to have, you know, benefited from one of those initiatives. MAS is, you know, we're currently working on a project right now with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is a very, you know, I guess, ambitious undertaking where MAS would seek to connect a startup and an FI, a financial institution, to complete one or two use cases that are relevant to the market. So that's something that we've taken advantage of, something that we're constantly using. So I'd say, you know, just to summarize your question, Stephen, my impressions of Singapore is it's a very good ecosystem to be in. Obviously, as Lisa was saying, to actively be in Singapore, sometimes it helps to set up a local operation. And again, this is something that we've done, and I'm happy to, you know, talk about that a bit later.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so we might turn to Lucas now, because we've had a pretty good explanation of the playing field here, but clearly they would need legal assistance to actually navigate the entry into the market. So perhaps you can just introduce yourself and then share some of the common themes that you highlight to clients as they look to enter into the Singapore market.
Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm a tech lawyer here in Singapore, and as Rebecca and Omaru said, there's a lot of opportunities here in Singapore, and the regulator, MAS, is really active in promoting Singapore as a fintech hub. And MAS covers banks, insurers, financial advisors, so all sorts of different activities. And fintech related legal work is very broad. So as Lisa said, on the commercialization side, you have financing, and you have technology contracts, you have intellectual property issues, data protection, and of course, financial regulatory and compliance. So the scope of legal work is quite broad, but as a priority, I think what you should look at is whether your activity should be licensed from a regulatory perspective by the MAS. Because without that, you won't be able to work in Singapore. And to do so, I think I would highlight one thing is that a fintech license or a passporting of license from Australia to Singapore is not real yet, or it doesn't exist. So you will need to be very careful when you enter the market. To do so, what I highlight to my clients to try to figure out if you need a license is what type of products or services you will provide in Singapore. Who are your customers? Are they retail investors or accredited investors, or what sort of customers you will deal with? What type of contractual arrangement you will have around the fintech? Where the funds are flowing, and to where the funds are flowing. And finally, do you handle any customer assets or money? I think those are the main questions that I would raise. Of course, we would need to deep dive in your services or products, but that will be the first step. Following that, we will try to figure out if you need a license. There are all sorts of licenses here in Singapore. So depending again on the product, the type of customers, we will deep dive. So in a nutshell, the objective before expanding to Singapore is to assess your product or your services and find the right license if you need to. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lucas. Okay, so we'll turn to Victor now, who introduce himself, and also perhaps to expand on what his role as head of Citi's Corporate Ventures Program and Partners focuses on, and then perhaps share with us some recent developments he's seeing in the fintech space and what opportunities he sees out there. So over to you, Victor.
Thanks, Stephen. So yeah, I'm a recovering entrepreneur. I actually moved to Singapore about 8 years ago with two of my companies. So I've experienced the market entry from both a small, struggling entrepreneur point of view, as well as from a large corporate, scaling a regional venture building initiative. Citi Ventures, as some of you may know, is the seat of Citi's head of innovation as well, globally. And it has a three-pronged strategy. So besides being a corporate venture investing arm for strategic investments that align with companies' kind of developmental aspirations, we also run a venture builder called D10X. And we also have a kind of like a, so to say, a sonar for trends on the behavioral emerging tech and kind of structural changes in the financial markets, which we call Studio. So my role in the region covers everything but the investment piece. While we support our investment team, investments are still run out of NAM for us. But as some of you may have seen, there has been an announcement. There's a role, so we'll put a person on the ground in Singapore for the regional investments conversation as well. In the major part of our focus here is on the talent side. Of course, we run different programs that help us connect and add non-traditional talent to the bank. Our venture builder, there's been a recent announcement for a project that was incubated and piloted in Singapore, but essentially is in partnership with a UK-based fintech called ShareGain. So this is an example of the type of work that we do. Usually, we don't talk about the rest of the work that we do until we take it to market. On the emerging tech and partnership side, what we do is we explore different ways of working with technology companies, with the regulators. We look at the various initiatives in the market that we should participate in, and I think that can be seen also from the fact that we've increased our activity in those spaces in the last 3 years since we built that structure. The Singapore ecosystem, as everyone else mentioned, is very vibrant, very networked, very active one, and you know, MAS has a very strong and significant part to play in that. And so it's no surprise that majority of the initiatives that I'm very excited about directly connect to the work that's done there. I would call out the sandbox, which is essentially a extremely good way to define the rules of engagement for larger enterprises and smaller enterprises to essentially build out test transactions, build out test offerings in a regulatory safe environment that essentially caps the risks for those and roll them to market to a limited scale. And I think that's something that helps a lot for larger organizations to move further and to move faster. Hopefully that can be expanded more regionally in ASEAN and beyond, as you know, this is it creates a great opportunity for companies headquartered in Singapore to essentially test some of the new offerings more broadly. I'm also very excited about Apex, the API exchange platform from AFIN. I think this is a great initiative, and the fact is that from the very beginning it has had a global aspiration and momentum. So we're keenly tracking that and you know, looking for ways to collaborate. And last but not least, where I'm partially involved as well, is Veritas. You know, there's a kind of I think the EU and Singapore have been most advanced in terms of calling out some of the rules on and definitions around AI. So you know, I find that effort very productive, especially because you know, from a larger institutional point of view, while as a technologist and as an entrepreneur, I appreciate the dynamics and the developments in the AI space. As someone representing an institutional, it's very, you start understanding where the difficulties to engage may be sometimes. So you know, I come from free range AI companies, and you know, having the experience within a large conglomerate like Citi, it becomes it becomes you know, I you know, start questioning myself, how was I able to get some things to market in the past? So things like that, being able to put out definitions and being able to put out rules are very important for the success of a startup ecosystem and its engagement with larger corporates. So that's my point of view.
Fantastic. Thank you, Victor, for that. Okay, so we might go back to Rebecca now, and you know, you touched upon, you know, your three main initiatives, I guess, that are going on. You know, we're sort of looking to a bit of the crystal ball, if you like, you know, in terms of future developments. We have all gone into COVID, but hopefully that's not forever. But are there any sort of initiatives that the MAS are sort of thinking about or planning in terms of keeping this fintech community vibrant and moving forward? Because the world keeps changing and evolving, and I don't know if you've got any thoughts you can share with us on that.
Yeah, for sure. And thanks, Victor, because a lot of the initiatives we're working on from MAS's side, you've just highlighted, and it's worth, all of these are listed on the FinTech Group's site within MAS. So if you wanted more information about Veritas, for example, or Apex there. We've been on an interesting journey, I think, with FinTechs over the COVID period. So when lockdown hit for Singapore March last year, there was a group of us that basically got on the phones and started speaking to founders about the challenges they were facing and the challenges they thought they would be facing, and also calling up investors to see what advice they were giving to their portfolio companies. Some of those investors who'd gone through the financial crisis before and were trying to kind of draw parallels of what the effects might be. And in response to those conversations and also more research that was done around this, we came out with the Digital Acceleration Grant in April last year, so just a few weeks after lockdown hit. And this acceleration grant basically makes available funds to help with digitization over the COVID period. So kind of support in offsetting cloud costs, productivity tools or collaboration tools. So that was April last year. As of March this year, we've had over 1,100 applications for that grant scheme. And so we just announced at the end of April that we're extending that for this year. So there's another 35 million that's been put into that grant scheme for companies here. So that's 65 million in total that's accessible. And again, that's just focused purely on supporting over the COVID period. And at the same time, we announced another 42 million in grants available for RegTech solutions. So we're quite keen to see Singapore become a RegTech hub, and this funding is made available for financial institutions to basically pilot and scale up with any RegTech. So that's kind of an interesting angle that we're hoping to grow out for this year. I think outside of the direct sort of support that MAS has given over the COVID period and maybe looking ahead, I want to come back to AFIX that Victor briefly mentioned. And for those of you that don't know, the API Exchange platform was seeded by MAS, the IFC and the ASEAN Bankers Association, basically to help facilitate financial institutions that are partnering with FinTech. So at its core, it's a marketplace where FIs can post problem statements and meet with FinTechs, get to know them. But then it's also an industry sandbox. So separate to the sandbox, the regulatory sandbox that Victor was just explaining, this industry sandbox allows FIs to test APIs of FinTechs and also to build prototypes using synthetic data in the platform. So the whole idea is that it accelerates that POC, that pilot process, so you can take back a kind of packaged business case to Citi, in your case, Victor, and say we should definitely scale up with this partner. And so a lot of the grants that MAS makes available for proof of concepts run on AFIX as the infrastructure behind it. So that's for the RegTech side and also for the FinTech side. So I'd really encourage all of you to take a look at AFIX and see whether it makes sense as a way for you to help build partnerships with FIs in this region. And it's not just the public sector that's supporting AFIX as this kind of infrastructure piece for collaboration. Also the private sector has come behind it as well. So there's one player, AMTD, who put a $50 million fund behind AFIX at the start of COVID, the Solidarity Fund, which any FinTech that is registered on AFIX can apply to. And it offers funding on a matching basis if you're raising funds. And there's still over 20 million, I think, in that pot available. So it's worth checking out for funding support. It's called the ASEAN Solidarity Fund. And you need operations here or in ASEAN to be able to apply to it. So that's something to think about if you are moving across. So yeah, check out the FinTech Group's website on MAS for more on the DAG, the Digital Acceleration Grant side. And then also, if you've got any questions about AFIX, I'm happy to take those at the end or take them afterwards.
Great. Just to add something to what Rebecca mentioned, they ran at the end of last year the Pay It Forward program on the Singapore FinTech Festival, which I thought was brilliant. I personally mentored there. It's a very good way for the industry essentially to pay it back a little bit and support entrepreneurs, either through basic advice or connectivity to some of the work that they're doing, which I thought it was a very well managed mentoring program.
Thanks. We'll be kicking that off again soon, actually, for this year. So it basically started off taking the speakers and the contributors for green shoots and basically getting them to commit several hours of their time on a monthly basis for anyone, literally anyone, to come onto our website and apply to spend time with them based on kind of 4 categories, whether you're looking for sales. Actually, Lisa, they match pretty much the categories that you were describing earlier around commercialization and capitalization. So yeah, Victor was a great mentor last year, and we'll be looking to expand that program for this year, and that's under the SFF website.
Great. Well, thank you both. So I'm sure our audience is chomping at the bit to come to Singapore, and so I think we might go to Omaru to say, well, how do you do it? What was your magic sauce to get set up in Singapore? How did you get your first customer? You've touched on this a bit before, but perhaps you can just expand on your journey.
Yeah. Look, I think in 2 ways, Stephen, groundwork, right, or homework. We spent 6 months in Singapore altogether. Initially, we came to Singapore through an Austrade program, the Lending Pet program. Essentially, that program, we were on the ground in Singapore. We spent 3 months meeting potential customers, learning about the Singapore ecosystem, going to different events, startup events, corporate events around Singapore, just to understand what the market is like, what the reception of our specific product is like. In this, session alone, I hear the word API a lot, which is, kind of validates why we went to Singapore in the first place. So we spent the first 3 months doing the Austrade program, And then I returned to Singapore to do another program. This time it was an accelerator called I-71. I-71 was also great in, introducing us to potential customers, to potential investors. So in the end, after that 6 months, we're able to get out of Singapore 4 very, critical aspects to any startup, right? The first was, product validation. While we're in Singapore, we got the opportunity to use the TrustWave cyber range. So essentially a cyber range it's a test environment where both startups and large cybersecurity vendors could deploy their product and then get an independent validation and a report that says, this product is great in the scenarios, not so good in the scenarios. Just a balanced, independent evaluation of the product. So we're able to do that. And then also we were able to secure seed investment from Singapore. And then the third part was the MAS grant, Financial Sector Technology Innovation Grant, which speaks volumes about our product, its readiness, but importantly, the relevance to the market. And then finally, and most important, is that customer that you talk about, Stephen. How we scored that customer was they are a service provider. So they helped us with what Lisa was saying, registration, incorporating in Singapore, because they're trying to do, incorporation in a very, faster way, mostly virtual way. They use a lot of APIs. And so as we were interacting with them, through them helping us incorporate in Singapore, we're also realizing how reliant they were on APIs. And these are very critical APIs that carry, sensitive data, right? So after they had helped us set up and we're looking after, our incorporation and the compliance requirements that come with that, we're then able to, to put through an ask to say, hey, you guys are doing great thing for us, would you allow us to help you, right? And that's kind of how the whole thing started. And, once you get your first customer, once you have that MAS, endorsement, it starts to get bigger. So, all it took was that 6-month investment in time and in commitment, right? But it's looking back now, it's such a great story because, every single box that we wanted to tick when we went into Singapore, we've ticked it and even more, right? So, the MAS project is not just us saying MAS, it's also cash. It's a cash grant, which for a startup, that's what you need. That's the oxygen essentially. So, it's been a very good journey so far.
Yeah, thank you, Omaru. It has been a great story. So, so Lisa, I might turn to you. And I think I mentioned at the start that our landing pad has supported many companies. Some have been successful, like Aculus. Some haven't, but they've gained a lot of knowledge along the way. And we've worked with you, and you've been very generous with your time and mentoring some of these scale-ups. But perhaps you can just share some of the qualities that you see around fintechs that have been able to be successfully established in Singapore. Are there any sort of general themes you can draw out in terms of how to be successful in this market?
Yeah, I think anyone who thinks that they can come to Singapore as a side project has really not thought it through. And so the ones that are successful are really focused on Singapore as a new market for the business. They've probably got some level of domestic penetration, although Omaru didn't in any significant way when he came. But the majority that have got some level of experience and track record in Australia generally tend to do better when they land. One is that they are more regulatory sensitive, so they are quickly able to tap into the MAS and the regulatory sandpit and understand how to navigate that ecosystem. Also, they generally don't just come for Singapore, they have views of an Asia or ASEAN play. And so that if you're coming just for the domestic market, obviously that is big on a fintech scale, but it's not as big as if you were going to scale this across the region. And so the other key thing is when they looked across the region as to what was going to be potentially phase 2, phase 3, they really connected with the fact that the business that they're building in Asia is potentially going to be significantly different to the business that they have in Australia. It's not a cookie cut. It does need market adaptation, and it certainly needs customer adaptation as you move into ASEAN. And I think the third key area, and probably one of the most important, is not underestimating the competition. Those that have been successful here, they understood that the competition in this market is pretty tough, and that they needed to come with their best game. Anyone who thinks that, you know, the competition is not going to perform has deeply underestimated their access to capital and their access to talent in this region. And those are the ones that generally tend to do better. They generally tend to get a higher valuation, and they generally tend to stack their boards with great cognitive and skill-based diversity. So they're building for global company day one. And that's a born global, as you say, Stephen. Those are the companies that are going to be successful in Singapore.
Great, thank you. That's great insights. So, Victor, I might just turn to you. You know, you've been on both sides of the fence now, on the entrepreneurial side, and now sort of with a large corporate behind you. Any sort of you know, nuances from that large corporate perspective in terms of the type of companies you're looking to work with?
So it depends on what hat we're wearing as well, right? So we have as I mentioned, a multi-pronged strategy across the region, and so different collaborations are viewed differently. In general, as I mentioned, ventures is strategic in most of the type of work that we do. So basically, we're very unlikely to be someone who's going to be an immediate buyer of something, of some product or service, unless it's specifically aligned to something that we're doing and adding well-defined value to it, right? So for those things, more tactical value propositions, more operational BAU business problems, that's probably, the labs are a very good contact, and we generally recommend reaching out to them. Now, back to the types of companies that we look at and how do we look at them. Transparently, we go through, validation, discovery validation, and delivery for our projects. And so different stages of evolution cater for different types of conversations. So when we look at discovery, we'd likely want to be inspired or to learn something that affects our business in the long run, right? Coming and talking to us about your vision, why your product should matter, and etc. That's a conversation we're always willing to have, but it might not lead to a tactical immediate engagement, right? This is a conversation that you can start somewhere in your journey with a view on 18 months down the line, potentially engaging with something that we do. And a lot of, funnily enough, like a lot of startups, me including, for example, in the early stage of my entrepreneurial career, are worried about sharing those ideas early on. So we're worried about sharing their view of the market, worried about sharing, what are they seeing that's disruptive for the large corporates? Well, the fact is that if the large corporate is likely to move into your field faster than you, they would have already done it, right? So, and by the way, most larger organizations are so bad at building nimble, rapid to market products and software in particular that they wouldn't even bother doing it, right? So you can openly engage and share with us, and we will try to figure out a way in the longer term on how to connect our organization to your value proposition. For validation, basically, we're looking at fit for purpose companies. So basically, we've already ran a product, we've identified a need either internally or with our clients. We've structured that need to a point where we understand where a solution can be deployed. Now we're looking for ways not to build our solution ourselves because of what I mentioned. So there we're looking at ways to connect, how do we actually test the value proposition, secure a proof of concept, and make sure that, and so that there we can move a little faster. And companies like, as I mentioned, ShareGain and many others have gone through that journey. That still could be a journey that takes a bit of time, but there we're very clear on what the outcome is, and we're designing a value proposition once we actually have some validation around it. Or we're basically testing the feasibility of something. And then on delivery, it's more immediate. There we're actually deploying something to the market, and it's very commercial. And it's very near-term oriented in here. In general, my advice to companies would be beyond what I mentioned about being open and less worried about sharing insights from how something happened from their point of view, is to understand the fit for purpose. So basically, where do you fit in that journey? How far is your product along, and what can you actually offer so that there's opportunity to collaborate? But also B, to make it easy for people like me to essentially figure out how to plug you in and where to plug you in, right? So if there's a incremental build, or if there's something to it's very unlikely, even though I love brainstorming and getting into meetings and like spending a lot of energy. Covering a region means that you don't have time to entertain too many of those, which means you have to pick and choose. Which means there is a clear path of engagement that makes it very easy, right? It's like, oh, hey guys, like this is what we can do. We can test this proof of concept. We can do it at our end, whatever. Like there's clarifying the path of engagement makes it very easy. Very few companies that I've met clarify how it's best to engage with them from the get-go. Most of them come and reach out and say, hey, let's catch up, or let's compare notes, which is very difficult to respond to because like there's a lot of notes to compare.
Yeah.
That's probably how I look at it.
Great, thank you, Victor. Lots of great insights there. So, Lucas, perhaps we'll turn to you now from your vantage point. Providing legal advice. We've touched a bit about what are the upcoming challenges and perhaps themes that you see. Perhaps we could get your insights on that. From what you're seeing in your client work at the moment.
Of course. Thank you, Stephen. Coming in, I had two thoughts, and I wanted to talk about artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency and blockchain. But hearing Omaru and Victor, I think that I will insist on AI because I think that Singapore is playing a great part and is at the forefront of AI strategy and building a trustworthy AI. This topic is very dear to my heart, so that's why I'm quite passionate about AI. So I thought that was a good, being with Omaru, I think is a great opportunity to speak about that. In Singapore, MAS, the Singapore Personal Data Commission, or the Singapore Academy of Law have published a lot of guidelines in the past year or two on building a trustworthy AI. So I think that's one of the challenges that you need to incorporate as soon as possible if you are going to work in this space. So like Victor said earlier, the EU and Singapore, I think, are very much, again, at the forefront of that. And they've published guidelines. So I think that to be compliant with what will most likely be a regulation in the future, which is not mandatory yet, I think you should take into account at least the Singapore PDPC guidelines, which means that when you build your AI, you need to ensure a few principles. So I will just mention them, and of course we can elaborate on them, but I think that you need to take into consideration explainability, transparency, fairness, and human centricity of your products and services. That means, for instance, that for explainability, that you will need to build what we call a black box recorder from very early stage. So that if in the future in Singapore, which is most likely and probably in other jurisdictions as well, you will need to implement those black box recorders as a mandatory requirement. I think that the earliest you take that into account when you build your AI, the better. And again, I don't want to bore you with all that stuff, but I think that working in Singapore could help you build those very good tools in your products. And if you use AI, you should use Singapore as a sandbox. And as Rebecca said earlier, MAS is really keen to experience and do new things in Singapore. So AI, great thing and a massive challenge for everyone, but Singapore is a great place to overcome it. Sorry.
Great.
Yes, I about other things, but I think AI is my main topic of the moment, I think.
Okay, no, it's very, very topical. It's certainly where the industry is heading. I might just ask Stuart, are there any questions in the audience in Melbourne? Is it opportune now before we move on?
Mics are open if anybody has questions.
Yeah, open.
Yeah, just maybe lean a bit closer. Sorry. One coming, Stephen. Any of the mics.
Hi team, how you doing? Thanks for the presentation today. It's been really insightful for a market that I know our company is definitely has on their radar, or a country that has on their radar. I'm from SwiftX, is a cryptocurrency exchange platform in Australia. So it's obviously regulation and that stuff is kind of quite close to our heart. I wanted to keep the question, I guess, not as specific to my own use case, but I guess seeing as the forum is presented, why not? So I guess it was more, the question was more around, you know, in what light or what regard is cryptocurrency platforms, you know, blockchain applications, what is the current sentiment within Singapore around that? And I know it's probably a bit of a broad question, but it's, you know, is there a general sentiment around those type of businesses being operated? And further to that is it, you know, absolutely necessary for businesses similar to ours to set up a Singaporean entity to start trading?
Okay, so I can see Rebecca is dying to answer that one from the MAS perspective, and then we might go to other members of the panel who have a view. But Rebecca, any initial thoughts on that around the cryptocurrency?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off, but I think Lucas is probably best placed to, given your second example was cryptocurrency, you can come in after that, after the AI piece. I think in general, Singapore is a very open and welcoming place for digital assets. The way our kind of view is internally is we don't necessarily, everything should be thought of as what the need is. And in Singapore, we have Pay Now, which means you can pay anyone with their mobile number in 3 clicks. We have SingPass, which is your digital identity that you can use to open a bank account in 3 steps. So we have national digital infrastructure that makes retail use cases for crypto not necessarily that useful in a domestic sense. It becomes interesting when you look at cross-border or you look at wholesale. And in both of those examples, MAS has pilots and experiments. So Project Ubin is one on the wholesale side that's gone through its phase 5 and has now reached a point where it's being taken forward by the private sector. So it's something that we're very interested to keep an eye on, and something that we believe strongly in, which is the cross-border side and then also the wholesale side. But for specifics about coming into this market as a crypto player, I'll hand over to Lucas. Okay,
can you hear me? I've just had a bit of a hiccup, but Lucas, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, please. Thank you so much. I think it's a good question. And building on what Rebecca just said, I think that Singapore is quite open to crypto exchanges. I've worked on a few, but even taking public examples like DBS, which is one of the largest banks in Singapore, is launching its own crypto digital exchange. Supported by MAS, and where the Singapore exchange, which is the called SJX, will take a 10% stake in that. So meaning that crypto exchanges are very much welcome in Singapore. However, cryptos themselves might not be recognized because Singapore is trying to have quite a neutral approach, and Rebecca might say more than me on that, but cryptos themselves are not recognized because they're not issued by a government. So they're trying to be quite neutral about it. So that's what you need to take into consideration. But if you want to come to Singapore, I think that it is possible, and you might need to be, depending on what you trade, you might need to be licensed, but that will require an in-depth analysis of what you trade. But I think Singapore very open.
Okay, Stu, do we want to go back to the audience in Melbourne for another question?
Yeah, it's Scott Gunther here from IAG Firemark Ventures. So Stephen and Rebecca, you work with my partner in crime, Prash, and our Firemark Labs team. So we're big advocates. We've been through this path, and I think we've been in Singapore for a few years. And so for the rest of the audience here, there's been really insightful, but we're proof that it's there, and we use this as a sandbox as well as a springboard back in. So help us drive innovation. We take our startup portfolio companies over, and it is a long journey. I think someone called that out a little bit. We're not in there just for the short term. And I think, Rebecca, you mentioned about grants. We're very fortunate enough to get some of the MAS grants, and Stephen, also some of the sponsorship that you guys provide, even to our current accelerator that's up and running at the moment. But probably a philosophical question for the group though, right? We use, for whether startups or corporates, Singapore as a springboard to Asia. I'd really like to get your views, and it might be a little bit, a bit of a dampener of a question, but COVID's rampant through India at the moment, and it's having a really, longer term implication that may actually have, ramifications about, corporates and startups jumping into Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia. Love to get some of your views and thoughts around this. Is there strategies in place? Are you already starting to see that people are turning away, or is this something that, again, we should just sort of start to ride out and, see that we'll be continuing to drive growth in this region, not just for us, but I guess the rest of the, Australian startup and innovation economy?
Can I make a vote on that, Stephen?
Yeah, sure. I was going to go to you anyhow, so.
Oh, awesome. Well, we're recruiting for our House of Deep Tech, which is obviously a Singapore calling program, and Singapore was just voted safest place on the planet. So we kind of have the opposite problem. Everybody wants to come, and the question is how many will the government let in? I think is really the opportunity. I also work across IAG, Firemark, 500, Plug and Play in the work that we do at R3I Ventures. Recruitment for founders to appear physically in an accelerator is going to be difficult for some time. That's just a reality. We're not going to get access to the talent that we want to land in those accelerators, and they're also going to be constrained on financial investment because people are being conservative. That being said, this is an incredible time to fundraise. There's a lot of liquidity in the market. And so what we're seeing is people making a digital landing into Singapore, landing into digital acceleration programs to immerse themselves in the ecosystem, get rapid connection to customer, get rapid connection to investor, and of course, leverage the support of partners like Austrade and MAS to connect deeply into the market on the back of those diplomatic engagements. So particularly in Southeast Asia, on the RegTech front, someone who's just landed in this region is Detexion. They're a SaaS security posture manager for the FinTech ecosystem. I'll fly their flag because they're champions out of the IAG Firemark Accelerator. These guys were instantly offered in Thailand an opportunity to be distributed by one of the largest security vendors. The opportunity is actually more like drinking from a fire hose in some of these markets and understanding whether or not it's the right time for the founder to scale. Because if you are going to land even digitally or via a partner into these regions, you need to have done the product adaptation piece first. You need to be in local language. You need to have mapped those customer experience journeys and made sure that your product, package, transaction, access, and support is in fact going to be enabled in that country on the ground by whoever those partners are, and that they have the competencies and capabilities to empower your customer experience. So I do think that the market demand is there. We've got Vietnam and Thailand rolling out their 5G at a rapid pace of knots, and potentially going to leapfrog the other markets on a RegTech front. So I think I wouldn't be holding back. I would actually be taking those tentative digital steps first and making sure that when you come, like I said, that you're focused, that you have actually invested resources to do the work, and that you do the preparatory work before you actually misstep, because so many people just run straight for the market as opposed to sitting back and doing that analytics and making sure that your product is fit for purpose, you are going to be regulatory compliant, and you do have the resources in place in order to drink from the fire hose.
Okay, so how's that for a positive summation? Stuart, I think our time's up. Is that correct from your side, and we should wrap it up here?
Any other final questions? I think that's everything from our side. So Stephen, Rebecca,
Great.
Ira, Victor, Lisa, and Lucas, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephen.
We'll see you
Thanks,
again
Stuart.
soon. Thanks so much.
Guys.
Thank you, everybody.